بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم نحن نقص عليك نبأهم بالحق إنهم فتية آمنوا بربهم وزدناهم هدى.
It certainly does not mean that religion changes. Instead, it means that some Islamic laws have been fixed since the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him and his family, while others are subject to change over time, in line with the development of human thought and understanding. It is observed that Quranic and Hadith texts that require interpretation were interpreted in the past differently from how they are interpreted today by qualified interpreters of Islamic texts. Another factor in changing rules over time is not the interpretation of the words of Islamic texts, but rather the improved understanding of their applications over time. The emergence of new areas of human experience that did not exist in the past, such as banking and cryptocurrency, or a deeper understanding of issues such as cloning and gender change. Therefore, the two main factors that affect the change in the changeable rulings are a change in the interpretation of Islamic texts or in the validity of a hadith, a better understanding of certain matters or the emergence of new issues that did not exist in the past. Keys include the core principles of belief, such as the oneness of God, his justice, prophethood, resurrection, and the divine authority of the imams, peace be upon them. Necessary obligations, such as daily prayers and fasting during the holy month, without their details. Necessary prohibitions, such as injustice, adultery, pork, and alcohol. These fixed foundations of beliefs and practices do not disappear over time, unlike the changeable, which includes details that depend on texts requiring interpretation and can change and vary from time to time and from scholar to scholar. Example 1. The obligations of a Salah, al-Hajj, and the method of starting the lunar month related to moon sighting. These general obligations are fixed and will remain until the Day of Judgment. However, some of the details of these obligations are open to interpretation because the wording of their texts is unclear, and thus their rules may change. This changeability is not only over time, but also at the same time, as one jurist may differ from another, for example, in the detailed rules of moon sighting, such as the limits of the regions sharing the moon sighting or the use of a telescope. Example 2. The verses of the Quran and the Hadith clearly prohibit loans involving conditional interest or raba. This rule is fixed and cannot change over time. However, new, detailed banking applications have emerged, and jurists differ on the permissibility of specific details, such as taking a loan with conditional interest from a non-Muslim banker who does not adhere to Islamic law. According to some jurists, non-Muslims are not required to abide by Islamic laws, such as the obligation to perform a Salah and al-Hajj. Similarly, they are not required to abide by the Islamic laws related to banking. Since the loan contract is not binding on both parties under Islamic law, some legal justifications are presented to enable securing a loan with interest from such banks through a different type of contract or legal arrangement. Can a fixed rule be changed to be in line with modern times? At the time of the revelation, no Muslims were living in regions of the Northern Hemisphere, so they were not exposed to fasting during extremely long summer days. Some thinkers argue that, because Muslims now inhabit those regions, the rule should be changed to fit their circumstances. To resolve this issue, they propose replacing the fixed rule of breaking the fast at nightfall with one based on the average sunset time in the Middle East, about 4 hours before the actual sunset or nightfall. Mainstream jurists counter that the Quran clearly indicates that fasting ends at the fall of night, that is fixed, and cannot be changed or interpreted otherwise. However, another fixed rule in Islamic texts allows those who cannot tolerate lengthy fasts to invoke the rule of difficulty and hardship, which overrides any obligation that causes difficulty and hardship. Therefore, For mainstream Shia jurists, the rule prohibiting the breaking of the fast before sunset is fixed due to the clear text and cannot be changed in modern times, provided the authentic Islamic text clearly establishes it. However, the rules of necessity and hardship, with their limitations, can override such a fixed responsibility. In a constantly changing world, Muslims continually encounter new issues that require an Islamic stance. Jurists are constantly striving to find solutions in the texts of the Quran and the Hadith, which can be interpreted to yield rules that adapt to and befit our modern times. Some of those topics include organ transplantation, artificial embryo insemination, abortions, birth control, sex change, and the use of medication derived from alcohol or the bones of animals not slaughtered according to the Islamic process. Therefore, if the idea of fixed and changeable rules is understood, the answer to the question, can Islam be relevant to modern times, should not be an issue. Our jurists would constantly seek solutions to determine the extent of the changeable rules and how they can be modified to fit modern issues without altering the fixed concepts and laws. It is not only the religious texts they look into, but also the whole process of ijtihad, including examining the holistic and integrated context of a specific text alongside other Islamic texts, the logical principles and methodology used in deducing a ruling, the historical context of the ruling, the study of the chain of narrators, and the science of interpreting ancient texts, including the development of linguistics and semantics over time. Guidance from a marja of a taqlid is not limited to religious rulings, but also extends to verdicts and declarations that address believers' socio-political problems, regardless of the country in which the marja resides. For example, he may provide guidance on socio-political engagement and social interaction for Shias living in countries where they are a minority. The guidance of our honorable senior jurists has been observed in various places around the world. For example, in Iraq, Ayatollah Sayed Ali Sistani has played a crucial role in maintaining Iraq's stability from the 2003 invasion to the present day. This has included emphasizing the strengthening of relations between Shia and Sunnis, and between Muslims and non-Muslims living in Iraq, and establishing harmonious and respectful relations among all Iraqis, regardless of their differences in faith or religion, to maintain a strong and united Iraq. It was done by the directions of the imams, peace be upon them, themselves. If referring to qualified scholars was necessary when the imams, peace be upon them, were accessible, it is even more essential during the major occultation, when direct access to the imam is no longer possible. Thus, a taqlid is not blind following, but informed reliance on scholars who combine deep knowledge with piety and integrity. It is also not an innovation, but a continuous practice established by the infallible imams, peace be upon them, refined over time and preserved to guide the Shia community to this day. Some claim that the method of al-ijtihad. This claim stems from a lack of awareness of the collective practice of a marja, which involves consulting experts in a field to guide them in addressing modern-day challenges. The ruling of Grand Jurist Sayyid Sistani, may Almighty prolong his shadow upon the believers, on the permissibility of gender change. He did not simply say yes or no. He provided considerable detail on the medical aspects of the change, whether it is external or internal. He explained that an external change alone is not sufficient. The internal organs determine the actual gender. He added that medical technology has not yet reached the level of internal gender change. This demonstrates that mujtahids can investigate, consult experts in relevant fields, understand the nature of the problem, and then return to the Quran and the Hadith, applying principles of deduction to arrive at God's law. Those who claim that a particular fatwa is against common sense must realize that the God-conscious marja of a taqlid abides by the religious texts, the Quran and the authentic narrations of the infallible, peace be upon them. Numerous narrations state that one should not issue a fatwa without decisive knowledge. Therefore, he would never issue a fatwa if there were even a slight possibility that a narration is unreliable, or if the indication of a Quranic verse or a reliable hadith were unclear. He would issue a fatwa only if the hadith were reliable and the words of the Quranic verse or the hadith were decisively clear, constituting the required knowledge to issue a fatwa. Otherwise, he would adopt precautionary measures. That is a strong indication of the integrity, piety, and trustworthiness of a marja. Verse of Surah Al-Isra 17:36. Do not follow that of which you have no knowledge. Indeed, hearing, eyesight, and the heart, all of these are accountable. This verse clearly prohibits any word, action, stance, judgment, or decision, including issuing verdicts and rulings without knowledge. Similar meaning has been reported in several narrations, including the hadith of Imam al-Baqir, peace be upon him, who said, "Whoever issues a legal ruling to the people without knowledge and without guidance, the angels of mercy and the angels of punishment would curse him, and he would bear the burden of those who act in accordance with his ruling." Al-Kafi, Al-Kalani, Volume 1, Part 2, Chapter 11, Hadith 3, and Volume 7, Part 6, Chapter 4, Hadith 2. Therefore, our mainstream jurists cannot bypass the Quran and the Hadith of the infallibles, peace be upon them, which are the sources of divine knowledge given to us to derive divine rulings that align with the will of Allah the Exalted. The Islamic texts prohibit us from relying on personal perceptions, command us to use the intellect, and instruct us to depend on the two heavy things, ath-thaqalain. The Prophet, peace be upon him, declared that these two, the Quran and Ahlul Bayt, peace be upon them, would never be separated until the Day of Judgment. If the Quran is living, then someone from Ahlul Bayt, peace be upon them, must be living with the Quran until the Day of Judgment. In our time, he is none but our living. Al-Imam al-Mahdi, peace be upon him. The content of the Hadith of the Khalain is authentic and has been narrated by many narrators in both the Shia and Sunni schools of thought. Al-Kafi, Volume 1, Part 4, Chapter 64, Hadith 1. Bypassing these two divine sources of knowledge and relying on personal opinions, perceptions, or common sense is problematic. In particular, common sense falls into a gray area that requires research to determine precisely what it is before it is used as a solid intellectual tool for deriving Islamic laws. There is no single, precise, universally accepted decisive definition of common sense across philosophy, psychology, and the cognitive sciences. Therefore, its definition is arguable, and so are its boundaries. At times, common sense considered sodomy normal among the people of Lut, peace be upon him, or idol worship, drinking alcohol, and adultery normal among the people of Mecca. When the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him and his family, preached against their common sense and norms. This shows that common sense can go to extremes. The invitation of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him and his family, was rational, yet it was rejected by their common sense, built by their ancestors. Those who killed Imam Hussein, peace be upon him and his family, had built up their common sense to accept their ruler and kill Imam Hussein, peace be upon him and his family, because he was contrary to the common sense, which is a mere perception accumulated in the minds of ordinary people, which may be right or wrong. That is where fatwa differs from common sense. A fatwa is derived through a rational, holistic understanding of Islamic texts, using logical methodology and rational concepts.
وصلى الله على محمد وآله الطاهرين وسلم تسليما كثيرا وحسبنا الله ونعم الوكيل